Hello, Blogging Heads Nation. I am Daniel Drezner. I'm a professor of international politics at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and I am also the author of Theories of International Politics and Zombies, a perfect gift one day after Halloween to buy for your loved ones.
I'm Heather Hurlburt, the Executive Director of the National Security Network, and coming down off the kind of candy hangover that you might expect from going out with a 7-year-old dressed as an M&M.
Oh, God, that would have been some serious candy haulage there.
Yes, and there will be a prize for the worst Halloween metaphor employed during this blogging.
Oh, this is good. This will replace the bad zombie puns from my book. But I'll offer my secret Halloween confession. This just shows how much of a bastard I am as a parent. When my kids were much younger, like about 5 years old, and they would go trick-or-treating, when they would come back and we would organize the candy, because that's what Drezners do. We organize the candy after we...
I hear a euphemism behind that.
Well, I would explain that
right?
there were, you know how you get the bite-sized candy, but then occasionally, some old school households will still give you the full Milky Way bar. I explained that was grown-up candy, and it was just too much candy for the kids to eat. So we would set aside the grown-up candy, and they bought that for a while, but now they've wised up to me.
I thought you were going to say that you were imposing tax, and I was going to tease you about what kind of libertarian conservative you are if you're imposing taxes. But I'm going for the first bad Halloween metaphor, which is to say that, of course, today is the Day of the Dead, or All Souls Day, and what we seem to have in Europe this morning is more up your alley as the Day of the Undead. So can you explain to me why the Greeks have done what they've done, and why the deal is unraveled, and why our retirement portfolios are all going to tank again?
This is where I will plead a little bit of ignorance, because I'm not entirely sure what's going on inside of Greek domestic politics, because essentially this is, Papandreou originally, I believe, saying, yes, we'll implement this package, but then deciding, no, we're going to put this to a referendum, which, of course, is what caused all the markets to tank. I have to assume that, in some ways this is what you've seen a lot of European politicians do, which is, on the one hand, they're being asked to implement incredibly unpopular policies. And it used to be the case, 10 years ago when the European countries were trying to create the euro, the promise of the euro seemed great enough so that a lot of countries, particularly in the southern Mediterranean, actually implemented, relatively speaking, forms of austerity as a way to get their budget deficit as a percentage of GDP in line. And they were able to say, we're doing this for to join the euro. And I think the problem is that lever is no longer terribly politically powerful. And so as a result, Papandreou, I think, is looking for some other kind of political insulation. And as a result, he's got to do this referendum. Although, I'll be honest, I'm not entirely sure how he's going to get that insulation, because it requires him to actually even more vigorously make the argument. The only thing I can posit is that he really thinks the social fabric of Greece is under that much threat that it requires everyone to own up to this particular problem. I think the larger issue is that really this is just round 37 of what I call Euro goggles. And I blogged about this for Foreign Policy, but we've seen this play out now, every 3 months for the last 2 years, which is essentially, the European countries are moving towards crisis. The southern Mediterranean countries are experiencing, higher and higher, either market pressures or increasing debt to GDP ratios. There is some European summit that requires France and Germany to commit to some kind of deal where they've either got to bolster the EFSF or require, private creditors to take a haircut for Greek debt, or come up with a mechanism to bail out, or at least, provide for European banks to shore up their capital base. And, it looks really, really bad. There's a lot of squabbling going on. And then, at the last minute, some kind of deal is announced, which actually causes markets to temporarily sort of engage in euphoria, right up until the moment where they realize there's absolutely no details whatsoever contained in the announcement. That it's just sort of these pledges, and then they've still got to work out the details, and of course the key thing is in the details, at which point markets then sober up and do that walk of shame back down to recession-level equity values.
So I have heard this explained slightly differently, which is that what we're engaged in, or what the Europeans are engaged in, is a prolonged process of kicking the can down the road until after the German elections, which are next year, And also that conveniently, kicking the can past the German elections also gives European banks more time to recapitalize. And the way it was explained to me was that if you really crammed down the Greek debt and then by extension the Italian debt, et cetera, right now, or a couple of months ago when this explanation was made to me, the banks actually couldn't take it, but that in another year and a half, they would have recapitalized enough that they could take the hit that they need to take. And what was said to me was, oh, don't worry, I know this looks totally incompetent, but it's actually fine, and it's the best way of edging forward slowly until both the European political economy and its economy can take the fix. Does that have any ring of truth to you, or am I just naively repeating what the bankers want?
I would say two things. On the one hand, politically, I sort of understand that logic. Economically, it's just a bunch of crap. In the sense that, well, I mean, seriously, it actually, it's one of these things where by politically kicking the can down the road, you make the problem so much worse that what's going to be required as a way of solving a problem is even more politically unpalatable. Because my understanding is, I mean, first of all, you have to separate the Greeks from everyone else. The Greeks are in a true sort of basket case scenario where they're simply going to be incapable of paying off their debt, and a genuine haircut is required. If you take a look at the other, southern Mediterranean countries, particularly Italy, I mean, yes, Italy has a high debt to GDP ratio, but if you take a look at their macroeconomic fundamentals, it hasn't been all that bad recently. And so in some ways, the problem has been that these countries are facing market pressures because, you're seeing this sort of contagion effect from Greece. So actually, had they tried to, let's say, bolster the EFSF now as a way to say, we're going to defend Italian debt, we're going to defend Spanish debt, it might have actually lessened market pressure, and as a result, they wouldn't have actually had to use the bazooka. So in that sense, they kind of needed their version of TARP, which had to be large enough to actually be effective and to somewhat, calm the markets, and they haven't done that for a variety of reasons. And the problem is by not doing it, by continuing to delay, all that markets are doing is paying attention to the fact that Silvio Berlusconi can't get or either is unwilling or unable to, get the sort of modest reforms he needs from his coalition. And really, if you step back for a second, let's keep in mind that, and this really should be the scariest fact that we should consider, is that in some ways a lot of the sort of financial stability in Europe is resting upon the fact that we're depending on Silvio Berlusconi to do the right thing. So, no, I think that's an insane sort of setup. In no small part because it overlooks the fact that by this sort of political uncertainty, and this is all political uncertainty at this point, it's what is France and Germany going to do, what is, will the EFSF be bolstered, you're actually retarding the very growth you need in order to be able to potentially make this easier to solve. So no, I think that I understand the political logic of let's wait until after the 2013 German elections, although one really does have to wonder, how is Merkel going to do in the 2013 elections, based on her performance over the last few years? This is something I blogged about before, which is what I, dubbed the Merkel algorithm, which is constantly kicking this can down the road, denying there's a problem, and then by the time the problem gets very, very big, she will, announce a half measure that doesn't really solve the problem. So this is actually an instance where, some sort of preemptive moves would actually be much easier. And even if there's a short-term political hit, in the long term you can point to the success. But by not being willing to take the risk now, it's just extending the crisis even further.
Well, let's ask a structural question about that, though. Does it actually matter at the bigger level how Merkel does? Because it seems to me that even if you had the Christian Democrats lose power in Germany, it's not as if the opposition escapes the same structural factors. And so, in a way, I think it's the fact of the 2013 elections that are destabilizing more than who's running or who wins them. Because ultimately, it doesn't seem to me that the Social Democrats either can or necessarily even want to get out of a particular role that Germany is kind of stuck with by being the biggest and strongest economy in Europe.
No, that's true. And let's say, in some ways, it's almost like it really is a political game of hot potato, which is, I assume both parties, I assume the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats want the other party to be responsible for taking what is going to be a hugely unpopular step of, expanding the FSF to the point where, it is essentially going to be a bailout, look like a bailout fund. So, no, I mean, the politics of this in Europe are incredibly ugly. So I don't necessarily disagree with that. And, what's interesting, I'm teaching a course on statecraft here at Fletcher, and one of the assignments they had to do was write an op-ed, sort of on a particular policy issue. And
that essential tool of statecraft, the op-ed.
Well, not all of these people are going to be diplomats. Some of them might want to influence foreign policy through indirect means. But yeah, I would argue the op-ed is actually pretty important. But that said, a lot of them were trying to make this case of Merkel has to do the right thing. And it was just painful reading these things because there was never a political logic for why she had to do the right thing. It was just do the right thing for the good of, Europe. And so as a result, I mean, the political scientist in me entirely understands what's going on. But the political economist in me is just horrified by how this is going to play out because it's not going to play out well.
So this is actually a question I have, and that if I had taken the theorist route instead of the practitioner route, this is the thing I would spend my time thinking about, which is that it's striking to me that at some level, when we start talking about the dysfunction in the European political system, we could be talking about the dysfunction in the U.S. political system, even when you get into talking about the dysfunction in, say, the Pakistani political system, which, I mean, is extreme by any standards. But in all these places, you have the problem that sort of the substantive challenges we face have just way outstripped the way our political imperatives are constructed. And that's true on a domestic level, and it's true on an international level. And it's really as if our whole construct of politics, and I say this as somebody who, sort of spends all of my time down in the trenches trying to remember to look out and, remember that there's a world out there. And I don't see how that gets fixed. And it plays out differently in the U.S. from Europe, from Pakistan, from China, from Japan, say, but you see a similar set of dynamics, it seems to me, underlying just the general dysfunction of politics everywhere.
Well, I mean, I would put it a little more sharply than you, I think, which is you can argue that the really disturbing thing about the period we live in right now is that the greatest source of geopolitical stability, instability in the world is not actually coming from the Middle East. It's not coming from South Asia. It's actually coming from the developed, advanced industrialized states. It's, what you're seeing in Europe. I mean, let me put it this way. This is not to say that obviously there's a fair amount of instability in those other regions, but those instabilities don't necessarily have broad, global economic effects. Instability in Europe or the United States, that actually does. And, we can also even throw China into the mix. But that said, I think it's particularly the kind of oddities of Europe and the United States that are a little disquieting because the last time this was the case was the 1930s. And so that's not a press. I went there. I did. I went there. And so, I really hope that obviously doesn't, I think there are limits to that analogy, to be fair, and I don't think we're necessarily there yet. But, if there's another dip, then that's going to be a source of concern. In terms of whether the politics, are truly dysfunctional, I mean, you're inside the Beltway, so you have a better sense than I do on this. But as an outside observer, I would say that the difference now than what we had even, let's say, 20 years. I mean, there's two differences. The first is that you don't have the amount of economic growth that often functions as a palliative for political problems. The great thing about growth, to be fair, as absurd as, let's say, Herman Cain's sort of solution to a lot of problems is growth, growth, growth. There is actually an intuitive political logic to this, which is if you grow a lot, it really does solve a fair amount of problems. And so, we're in a world of very minimal growth, and that creates one issue. I think the second issue is that what used to be thought of as sort of unspoken political norms have simply disappeared. And all that you have left are the sort of bare rules of how the system is supposed to function. So, in Europe, you had a situation where, when push came to shove, France and Germany would get in a room, they would hammer out a compact, they'd make sure that the Brits and the Italians were on board, and then you would just sort of go forward. And the notion was that in the end, we're not going to let Europe collapse. Similarly, within the United States, there were certain norms like the notion that you're not going to hold the debt ceiling hostage to other political, demands. That in the end we have to be the grown-ups in the room, and so in the end, those sort of pro forma things will be done, and you'll actually contest domestic politics on what are substantive policy grounds. And I think those things have been swept by the wayside. And as a result, the new, what we're dealing with now is a system that does occasionally accomplish something, but the transaction costs of doing so are just so much higher that a lot is sort of falling by the wayside.
So speaking of which, that actually seems like a perfect segue into the Middle East for a moment. And you have here sort of the geopolitics version of the butterfly flapping its wings in the Amazon. Because you have now unspooling, starting as of yesterday, this wonderful chain of events where, and I say wonderful in the purely sort of observational scientific sense, where Palestinians, having gotten very frustrated with the sort of apparent inability to get the Israelis to come to the negotiating table, having significant domestic internal problems, the government in Ramallah feeling weak and under threat, devising this gambit of going to the UN for membership, having that sort of cleverly bottled up in the Security Council by the US and others, then saying, okay, we'll start taking our case to the specialized agencies, both because that can get us political outcomes that will be helpful at home. For example, joining UNESCO, we can then ask for World Heritage status for Bethlehem, and that can be belonging to us, the Palestinians, and not to the Israelis. Looking at places where they can join the court system, looking at ways to embarrass Israel over its covert nuclear program. And the more of those agencies we belong to, the more that they think helps their bid at the UN, again, helping shore up the government's status at home and helping, in their minds, at least shore up their status internationally vis-a-vis the Israelis, which the logic goes will then bring the Israelis back to the negotiating table, which I'm not sure I agree that that's actually will happen, but that's the logic. So, but that's the butterfly. You can agree, you can disagree, you can like it, you can not like it, but that's the butterfly. Then you have the wonderful butterfly of American politics, which back in 1994, as a way of punishing President Clinton for some Middle East peace outreach that had been undertaken at that time, bipartisan legislation passed Congress providing that any UN body which admits Palestine has to be immediately defunded by the United States. No ifs, ands, no waivers, no delays, no nothing, no out clause. Now, it's fun to think about how different the world actually looked in 1994 when this was passed, that you didn't have, for example, the United States training Palestinian security forces. You didn't have U.S. troops stationed all over the Islamic world. You didn't, of course, have the Arab Spring and democratic governments responsible to their peoples on this issue. But the other thing that you didn't have, and you could actually, Dan, probably give me numbers on this, is the extent of U.S. private sector globalization was also much smaller than it is now. So you didn't have the degree to which American business, or business that we used to think of as American, completely dependent on the bare bones of international norm and practice. So now, the butterfly flapping its wings is if the Palestinians join the World Intellectual Property Organization, the U.S. has to pull out, which means that the protection that patents taken out in the U.S. has worldwide goes away, all because of domestic legitimacy problems inside Palestine. That's nuts. That's wildly dysfunctional and wildly out of proportion with whatever your position on Israel-Palestine happens to be. Similarly, the International Atomic Energy Agency. Palestinians join that. We drop our 25% contribution. We lose our seat on the executive board. Now, we lose our seat on the executive board just as, by the way, the IAEA is getting ready to consider a new report on the state of Iran's nuclear program. Now, you would think from a statecraft point of view it would be incredibly stupid to lose our seat. And you would think, by the way, that our ally Israel, which sees Iran as an existential threat and Iran's nuclear program as an existential threat, would be particularly concerned to have us on the executive board at such a time. And so the best thing we could do to be supportive of our ally Israel would be to make damn sure we didn't get thrown off the board of the IAEA. But our inflexible domestic politics, you can't, it's very hard to imagine Congress reversing this law and giving the administration some flexibility. So here we have, these butterflies creating just a complete, I have a piece up on the New Republic this morning about this, sort of comparing it to the disastrous, ugly loss for the Washington Redskins last weekend. They got shut out.
Oh, they did? I'm so sorry about that, Heather.
Well, I have to say, I'm not a Redskins fan, so there's a certain amount of schadenfreude about
I'm a New York Giants fan, so this is where,
Oh, man, that was really painful, too, because I'm a hopeless sucker for the really, really bad teams, and so I was kind of rooting for the Dolphins to win that one.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm a hopeless sucker for the underdog. That's just something you got to know about me. But anyway, so here is this defeat, which is largely self-inflicted, really, really brutal to watch, and presages even more bad things for the future as the world looks at us and says, wait a minute, you have the biggest economy in the world, the biggest military in the world, and you can't get out of your own way to pursue your own strategic interest?
Well, okay, a few things. No, that was a good rant. I got to say, I got to applaud you on that. I mean, let me first say that I'm shocked that Congress, by mandating something in terms of foreign policy, has really stepped into it. I mean, wow, Congress has never done that before. Actually, the thing this reminds me of was when India and Pakistan both conducted nuclear tests in the late 90s. That triggered an automatic set of sanctions on both countries. And eventually, I will say, did require Congress to have to reverse course on it, because eventually the U.S. sort of recognized, look, this is undercutting our strategic interests. So, that maybe offers the hope that Congress would reverse this. On the other hand, as you say, the domestic politics of dealing with India and Pakistan are radically different from the domestic politics of dealing with Israel. That said, I think the only way this happens is if you have Israel and AIPAC decide, whoa, wait a minute, what's about to happen here if, Palestine gets recognized by a whole bunch of these places? I would hold out some hope for the possibility that Congress has to reverse course on this, even though it would be humiliating and, but then again, really, is that anything new for Congress?
Well, there's a structural question there, actually, because the other force that didn't apply so much in the India-Pakistan, although actually the India-Pakistan case, you had some pretty angry defense contractors, if you'll recall, is that, as I said, American business is now very implicated. But the crazy thing that you have, and you see this if you have occasion to have dealings with the Chamber of Commerce, is that the international side of the Chamber, actually has many of the same goals that I have as a sort of, how do I want to describe myself?
Kenyan socialist?
As a liberal internationalist. Okay, yeah. That you want a functional, rules-based international system in which laws and contracts can be enforced. They're more concerned about business law. I tend to be more concerned about civil liberties, democratic and human rights participation law, but law is law at some level. So you have that side of the house in the business community versus the domestic side of the house, which let's say takes its cues from another era in thinking about what's best for U.S. business. And those are the folks who drive, frankly, the political contributions and who drive who gets elected, and that you'll sort of talk to very smart corporate folks who'll start complaining about Congress. And I kind of always want to say, but you guys those are the folks you gave money to, and they'll look at you, and they'll say, oh yeah, but that's the domestic side of the house. So this is another way that our whole establishment is just kind of out of kilter with its own.
Well, part of it, to be fair, international business in terms of lobbying the United States has been actually relatively, obviously they've done things, but if you take a look at how they've acted on, let's say, the Doha round, or even sort of the bilateral free trade deals that just got passed, they haven't been really all that, active in terms of pushing for them. You can argue that in some ways the business lobby hasn't done that kind of thing since China's admission to the WTO. And the reason is that by and large they've been pretty happy with the system as it's been. The U.S. is remarkably open. Despite, occasional bouts of protectionist sentiment in the Congress, they haven't actually done anything. And so what might be interesting is whether or not this sort of thing winds up being a wake-up call to the sort of internationalized part of U.S. business saying, wow, now our problem is not, we've had it good, but now we're beginning to see pressures that might actually lead to steps towards closure, which that would not be, necessarily in their interest. So it would be interesting to see if this is a wake-up call. The other thing, though, is to be fair, what is the likelihood of Palestine actually getting membership in some of these organizations? UNESCO is one thing, but, the IAEA or WIPO might be something else.
Well, actually, funny you ask. I had occasion to look into this yesterday, and the beautiful thing with WIPO is that the conditions for joining WIPO are that you have to belong to one of the UN specialized agencies.
Oh.
So now that they belong to UNESCO, they can join WIPO.
Okay.
And the IAEA is a bit more complicated, But there are, I think, international political reasons around which, if the Palestinians decided they wanted to do that, you could imagine a lot of countries thinking that would be a really great idea for a number of reasons. So I hope we don't see that, because I think it politicizes. There's a lot of unpoliticized cooperation at the IAEA around not just nuclear weapons, but also nuclear power, and I would really, really hate to see that get politicized, but you have
to. In some ways, this goes to this goes back to the domestic politics question you talked about, which is, on the one hand, you can go to Ramallah and say, okay, you've managed to find a very, very, interesting lever. What can be done to, prevent you from actually exercising it? But then you start to wonder, is there anything that would prevent them from starting to exercise it? Because if you take a look at, Abbas's position, it's not a great one. And so, is there a point at which he's just going to go for the political symbolism, period? Because that, in his mind, is the only way he can retain political legitimacy, given, how the Israel-Palestinian process has played out over the last 3 years.
Well, actually, that's funny. I thought you were going to take that in a slightly different direction, and this is a point you made in your latest ongoing beef with Steve Walt, which I really liked, which is, of course, the U.S. isn't the only one that has domestic politics. I mean, you could argue that that Netanyahu feels very constrained. Whether he is truly as constrained as he feels that it is a sort of a question between him and God, but feels very constrained by the right wing of his coalition government, which is certainly even less interested in negotiating seriously with Palestinians than he is. So you do have this situation where the U.S., the Israelis, and the Palestinians all have domestic political constraints that are pretty damn close to crippling. And then the question, again, arises of, in this era where everybody's domestic constituencies are more empowered than they were in the past. And by the way, lest people forget, one of the other dynamics here is that the Palestinian citizenry is ready to have its Arab Spring, too. And is sort of looking at its government as part of the problem, which ought to be something that people in the West would be jumping up and down and hooting and hollering for joy about. But there isn't the scope to be, there doesn't seem to be the scope anywhere for a constructive response.
No, and of course the great irony is that at this point I think Hamas is actually much less popular in Gaza as a result of having a rule, and I assume Fatah is extremely, is much less popular in the West Bank. It is domestic politics all over. Although, as you pointed out, I've been having a running debate with Steve Walt over, sort of evaluating Obama's foreign policy record / legacy, however you want to see it. And, I will say, though, that on Israel-Palestine, I do think he deserved, Obama did commit a couple of serious blunders. Now, they weren't entirely of his own making. As you point out, the domestic politics in both Palestine and Israel are pretty severe as well. But some of the initial negotiating positions that he sort of adopted, can't you argue they put Palestine into a bind? The notion of you can't go back to talks unless there's a freeze on housing settlements?
Yeah, in retrospect, I don't think anybody thinks that the way that the settlements piece was handled advanced.
Right, and no, it actually made things worse because it actually forced the Palestinians to toughen up a position that they were actually prepared to, not necessarily going forward. And this actually, and this is an interesting segue of itself, this, by the way, is the one valid criticism I've seen made by the GOP foreign candidates for president against President Obama. I mean, when you talk about the foreign policy criticisms levied by the GOP 2012 candidates, the one country they managed to talk about seems to be Israel. Beyond that, there's not a whole hell of a lot of actual concrete conversations about foreign policy.
Well, a point that I think people should, that oftentimes foreign policy practitioners don't recognize, is that within American conservative politics, Christian Zionists are now at least as important, and probably, especially in a primary context, more important than the American Jewish community.
Particularly in the GOP side.
There's some kind of reflexive assumptions about who's being played to, and actually who's being played to is Christian Zionists. So that is one point. And then, I mean, sort of moving to the larger question of the 2012 field, it's just the incredible vanishing GOP foreign policy establishment. In that, on the one hand, all the folks that I knew, during my first years in Washington when George H.W. Bush was in power, and similarly some of the people who sort of hung on hopefully and in the second term of George W. Bush, are either sitting this one out or are sort of forlornly hanging out with John Huntsman, hoping for lightning to strike. And that you have, this fascinating thing that has happened where you really have a lot of classic neoconservatives and Bush first-term retreads who have populated the various campaigns, so that for all that, there was all this talk of the Tea Party, you actually have a very neocon field of foreign policy advisors. And then sprinkled on top of that, I actually heard a Republican pollster go on the radio last week and say, look, Republicans need to stop going after Obama on national security. It's not going to work. He killed bin Laden. He killed al-Awlaki. He killed Gaddafi. So, pity the conservatives who actually have kind of had their sort of core talking points pulled out from under them. And you see the core argument that they want to levy is weak and doesn't love his allies. And then you come back and say, oh, did I mention that he killed Osama bin Laden? And, then you sort of need to switch back to talking about the economy. So you're going to see, I think, Israel because of the primary. You're also going to see Iran, although there again, there's not really a coherent alternative that doesn't involve starting a third land war, which doesn't seem like a winning plank for anybody. And then, they're a little bit stuck. And the bizarre thing about this, and I promised I would issue an apology, so I am now going to issue an apology to the Blogging Heads community for all the times that I have ever said to any of you individually or on the screen that American politics really needed to pay more attention to foreign policy. Because there are going to be not one, but two national security debates among the GOP presidential contenders on November 12th and November 15th. And I feel that I may bear some small share of responsibility for that, and I want to apologize.
Well, I would say a few things here. First, I guess I have to apologize as well because I've been having a lot of. Well, actually, you know what? I'm not going to apologize. I would like to thank the class of presidential candidates for the 2012 nomination for the GOP because, dear God, the amount of blog fodder they have produced on foreign policy alone is just massive. I mean, seriously, Herman Cain, keep running. You're doing a fantastic job on foreign policy. Keep cracking those jokes because let me tell you, the folks love them. And really, my blog hits go through the roof. So thank you so much for that. Okay, back to seriousness. This is embarrassing. There's just no other way to put it. I actually think your characterization of the GOP field is overly generous because, in fact, most of the fact is you take a look at sort of the sprinkling of foreign policy advisors. Most of the ones who, you would trust have probably gone to work for Mitt Romney. And Mitt Romney has produced, at least a foreign policy document, which I know you guys at NSN have gone after hard. And I don't want to get into the particulars of it, but at least it's actually a foreign policy document, There's something you can read there. It's longer than 5 paragraphs.
It mentions more countries than...
Right, and to be fair, he actually has some detailed policies. Again, you can disagree with the content of them, but there are actual policies there. You take a look at the rest of the GOP field. I mean, again, I would say in defense, Ron Paul and John Huntsman have both articulated relatively clear foreign policy doctrines. But again, let's be blunt, they're not going to win, so it doesn't matter. If you take a look at the other candidates out there that are, potentially viable, Rick Perry or Herman Cain, it's just a fucking joke. There's just no other way to put it.
I think you're being unfair to Rick
Am I being unfair to Rick Santorum?
He's thought a lot about these issues, Dave.
I detect sarcasm in your voice. Santorum's not, it...
Oh my gosh, and Newt Gingrich, you're being wildly unfair to Newt Gingrich, the intellectual.
I'm not even going to go to Gingrich. But seriously, the amount of, I think it was The Atlantic put up a list of sort of the great foreign policy disasters or misstatements or so forth made from this campaign. And it truly is gobsmacking the amount of idiocy that has been spouted by these people. And to be fair, I think the reason is, first of all, this, as you point, this isn't going to be a foreign policy election. It really isn't. The fact that there are 2 debates on it is going to be fascinating. And the other fact is that you and I and maybe 5 other people are going to be the only ones watching it. And I'm not sure about you.
Well, I have to say there was a near mutiny at our staff meeting yesterday when I announced that some people would have to spend their Saturday night watching the Saturday night debate. I mean, I had to promise to have people over to my house and serve alcoholic beverages. And I want to assure that all my interns...
Okay, there we go. But no, I mean, this is, I have to admit, a sort of impotent rage that I feel now at the candidates, because the conversation on foreign policy has been at such an unserious level that really you sort of wonder exactly, this is how bad it is. Joe Biden actually, talked about how there had to be a certain standard for foreign policy discourse to become president. This is Joe Biden saying this. Now, I know you like Joe Biden, but I mean, let's face it, the man has made more than his fair share of statements that he shouldn't have made in public.
Right, but you also know that he knows where those countries are, even if his knowing where they are did consist of having plans to carve them up that weren't really so smart.
Potentially, but I mean, in some ways, this is actually there is in some ways. I will say this about Herman Cain, in particular. I mean, Cain's defense on this is always that I'm going to rely on experts and advice, and so I don't want to comment now. And to be fair, there are actually sometimes where I think that's appropriate. Like talking about the Iranian assassination plot of the Saudi ambassador, I think Justin Logan at Cato made this point that, he doesn't have all the evidence on that, and that, therefore I'm actually willing to give him a pass because, unless he has a full briefing, it's just sort of the bizarre thing where even, other foreign policy commentators don't know. But that said, the notion that he's somehow going to manage to sort of gear up and be able to take expert foreign policy advice, that actually requires that you know something to begin with. It's like, and as I said on the blog, it's like trying to learn calculus without knowing any algebra whatsoever. And none of these guys know any algebra. It really is truly scary. And I'm sorry, I'm on a rant here, but Jesus, it's just pathetic.
So I'm actually, this is funny, but I do think it's an interesting thing about Romney and Perry, right? Both of whom have been governors, both of whom traveled abroad a certain amount, and both of whom, like to brag about bringing jobs home to their state. So at one level, I actually think either Romney or Perry on the sort of non-crazy cluster of issues, you'd get a pretty standard I don't want to use the word mercantilist because I don't mean it in its technical sense, but you'd get a pretty standard kind of American business-focused foreign policy. Sort of let's not take off business elites in other countries necessarily.
I think Hamiltonian might be the best example. It's Walter Russell.
Yeah, that might be a little too generous actually, but yes, I think they would have advisors who could guide them toward a Hamiltonian policy, but the craziness that is the modern conservative movement is that you'd have that basic instinct, which I'd be prepared to give them both credit for, sort of warring against this unfettered Jacksonianism, so if you want to go there, which all their advisors represent. And by the way, Romney's advisors don't even agree with each other. Romney's got this incoherent group of folks who don't agree on Afghanistan, who don't agree on Iran, a guy who seems to have been working with Lebanese militias and death squads during the Lebanese Civil War, which is always nice. So, I would give them credit that their own life experiences would make them sort of Hamiltonians in a way that I might not agree with, but that I could imagine working with as a foreign policy professional. But the overlayer of what has become the conservative movement in America is so hostile to that I don't know how either on the campaign trail or in governing they could produce kind of a consistent Hamiltonian policy.
I would say part of the problem we've got here is that we're in a situation where, and again, this is the best defense I can offer the GOP field, which is foreign policy is not going to matter in this election. It's not going to matter for two reasons. The first is, as you say, and it's been pointed out, the one thing the Obama administration has done is basically neutralize this issue. I think there was an NBC Wall Street Journal poll that showed, he's got a 61% favorability rating on foreign policy. That same poll showed that 6% of Americans think that national security and foreign policy should be the most important job of the president, which I think is the two data points you need to know, which is first, by and large, they think Obama's doing okay on foreign policy, but second, no one cares. And so as a result, there's very little pressure on these candidates to actually kind of articulate any kind of foreign policy doctrine whatsoever. And in some ways, maybe this is a failing of the foreign policy community, because there's an extent to which, it's not clear to the American people the ways in which, expending blood and treasure abroad or negotiating treaties or things like WIPO actually do in the end affect American jobs. That dumbass statement that Cain made about Uzbekistan, how would that create one job? You know what? There's actually a fair amount of foreign economic policy that actually does create a fair amount of jobs. And if you do it badly, destroys a fair amount of jobs. And, you know, I'd like to think that the former CEO of Godfather's Pizza knew that. Sorry.
So, two things. One is that I do think, and this is where I get into my sort of ranting, nonpartisan foreign policy professional hat, that just in general, our political class and our business class have totally failed to make the case to Americans what Americans know instinctively about how, you know, all the sort of gobbledygook about how we're all interconnected with the rest of the world, that we've all been kind of slinging around in uninteresting ways for the last 15 years. But we've really failed to integrate that into people's daily lives. And if anything, I think right now we're seeing a backing away from that. So that's one thing. And the other thing is, the more, you know, I'm stubborn, and I like to be kind of counterintuitive, and if you tell me things are impossible, I tend to run in that direction. So the more people say that this isn't going to be a foreign policy national security election, the more my little mind goes digging off in the other directions. And so I will here offer on video 3 or 4 things that you should be watching for, because they would totally change that either permanently or at the very least temporarily. One of them is, I think the North Koreans will test a weapon between now and the election. I think there are 2 times they will do it, either around the sort of when the caucuses and the primaries start, or, by the way, the nuclear security summit that was held in the U.S. a year and a half ago, it's being held in Seoul in March, with 40-some heads of state sitting less than 100 miles from the North Korean border. Now, if you were Kim Jong-il, what would you do? So that's one. Point 2 that people need to keep an eye out for, that I certainly am not focused on every day, is that Hugo Chavez is very ill. Hugo Chavez apparently has
terminal cancer. I thought he was cancer-free. At least that's what he claimed. I'm sorry. Go ahead. And he always tells the truth, you know.
I love it when you get all touchingly naive on me, Dan. That's going to be one of those little pull-up lines. But Chavez, if Chavez dies, there's nobody to succeed him. It's very unclear how you would hold the Venezuelan state together. That has regional implications with respect to Colombia. It has implications with respect to the oil markets, and it'll start a frenzy of, why isn't the U.S. intervening to prop somebody up? Why do we hate our friends so much? Why were we so unprepared? And it'll excite the whole sort of latent Latin American discussion. So that's another one I'm watching with interest. Third is the possibility of something, either a terrorist attack happening in the U.S., which is less likely than it used to be, less likely to be big and catastrophic, but you can never entirely rule out. Or, and I think this gets worrisomely more and more likely the more we kick Iran, you know, a kind of Khobar Towers or Beirut Barracks attack somewhere in where we have troops stationed. And any of those, or, you know, then I think the last thing is sort of circling back to our initial topic. I mean,
I was going to say, if you're asking, you know, I'll offer my examples of what, although, first of all, speaking of touchingly naive, I love that you think there's a latent Latin America discussion that's waiting to be happening, you know, in the American political system.
Well, it is the fastest growing segment of our population.
That's true.
It is going to totally flip the voting demographics of large parts of the country someday.
Yes, and there's that whole big illegal immigration problem. This is, I'm sorry, one more thing.
Yeah.
I love that the one time that, you know, the GOP field talks about, you know, foreign policy, it really is about illegal immigration. And none of them have said the sort of key point about this, which is illegal immigration has slowed to a trickle since 2008, because, gosh, it turns out that if you have a large financial crisis and your economy goes into recession, people don't want to come here because there are no jobs. So, you know, it's almost like, you know, if you want to really solve that problem, just keep, you know, having the economy go as it is, and you will solve the illegal immigration problem.
Also, by the way, the border, one of the safest places in America, much safer than the cities that you or I are walking around.
So, okay, that
just for the record, but
we digress. All right, I think that the sort of big 3, you know, issues that might force foreign policy onto the issue. The first one, as we said, is Europe. If in fact, you know, the euro winds up triggering another financial crisis, that's obviously going to become, you know, a global problem. And the real question then is, what is the United States going to do to potentially have to help out its European allies? And that's going to be very interesting to see among the GOP talking about allies, because normally when they say, you know, Obama has thrown allies under the bus, they're primarily talking about Israel. I'm not sure how they feel about Europe, and that'll be an interesting question. The second is if you see rising domestic instability in China. China is looking at a property bubble that's going to be pretty serious, and you're starting to see sort of early warning signs of the banks being clamped down in terms of offering loans and a lot of increasing bankruptcies. China's non-performing loans as a percentage of GDP are pretty high. So if China actually, faces a serious downturn that leads to political instability, that would be an interesting conversation. And that actually, I think, is an important one because I think China, talking about policy towards China is actually something that matters. And the third one, I agree with you. I think it would be a terrorist attack if there's going to be one. I would assume it'll be in Iraq that happens as, the U.S. forces are getting out over the next couple of months. And that will, of course, crystallize a potential GOP criticism of Obama, which is how dare he actually accept the Bush administration's status of forces agreement and honor it. But that said, I want to close on one question. As you say, there's going to be two GOP foreign policy debates. I assume none of these people running these debates are going to ask either of us for questions to ask. But that said, Heather, if you could ask the GOP foreign policy candidates, or presidential candidates, one foreign policy question, what would it be? Only one. Well, you can offer more than one if you want, but.
Because in fact, one of the things we do in our day job is we do try to influence what questions get asked, not necessarily with much success. But I would. Let's see. I think I have.
Okay. Oh wow, you're good.
One is to talk about defense spending in the context of the current austerity debate. Do you really believe that the Pentagon is the only part of the U.S. government that's exempt from the waste, fraud, and uselessness that you claim the rest of the government is plagued by? And what are the things that you would prioritize the Pentagon doing, and what are the missions you would not prioritize in a time of austerity? That would be question number one. Question number two would be Admiral Mike Mullen, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, has said that a war with Iran would be a very problematic idea with unpredictable consequences. Gates, before he stepped down, said that anyone who wanted to start another land war in Asia should have his head examined. Do you agree with these military leaders that a military attack on Iran would be a bad idea with bad consequences? And gosh, my third question. Oh, I have so many. You know what? I'll just stick with those two for the moment. What are yours? Okay,
since you offered two, I will offer two. I think my first question would be about the ongoing euro crisis and what steps, as U.S. president, would you be prepared to take to either backstop the European economies and or prevent a financial catastrophe from taking place? Because that would actually have to force them to go on the record to talk about whether or not something like TARP would be an issue or not. But that's not a terribly well thought out question. The question I really want to ask is the following. All of these candidates, with the exception of Ron Paul, have stressed that there should be no daylight between the United States and Israel on matters of foreign policy. So I would therefore like to know which of these candidates would pledge to release Jonathan Pollard, a spy, an Israeli spy that was captured and sentenced and is in.
No. You can't explain who he is. Part of the test is seeing how many of the candidates know who he is.
Basically, will you honor Israel's request to have Jonathan Pollard sent back to Israel? And if not, doesn't that indicate there is some daylight between you and Israel?
Now, that brings up two more for me, which is similarly, all of you have said that on difficult questions such as Afghanistan, you would listen to the advice of the commanders in the field. Why are you so unwilling to listen to the advice of the commanders on the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell? Why, Governor Romney, did you oppose the military brass on the ratification of the START Treaty? And then lastly, how do you reconcile the images of young people across the Arab world waving their Facebook and making signs in English and quoting from Martin Luther King with Newt Gingrich's statement that the Arab Spring is an anti-Christian spring?
Okay, and with that, I think this has been, let's face it, some nice foreign policy rants, and it's been always enjoyable ranting, with you and not against you, Heather.
Yes, and we will reconvene and we will see how we're doing.
Oh yes, I think that's an excellent idea. We're going to suggest to Blogging Heads we should, after the two foreign policy debates, I think we'll need to do an after-action report, and I think liquor is going to have to be involved in that one.
I haven't haven't done a late night blogging heads since I did one with what's his name from the Weekly Standard in Denver at 2:00.
Oh, really? Okay.
Which was fairly surreal.
That's good. I kind of like the idea of right after the 15th. Maybe we could do it. We'll have to talk about that. All right.
Okay. Very good.
Take care, Heather.
Thanks, Dan.
Germany to commit to some kind of deal where they've either got to bolster the EFSF or require, private creditors to take a haircut for Greek debt, or come up with a mechanism to bail out, or at least, provide for European banks to shore up their capital base. And, it looks really, really bad. There's a lot of squabbling going on. And then, at the last minute, some kind of deal is announced, which actually causes markets to temporarily sort of engage in euphoria, right up until the moment where they realize there's absolutely no details whatsoever contained in the announcement, that it's just sort of these pledges, and then they've still got to work out the details. And, of course, the key thing is in the details, at which point markets then sober up and do that walk of shame back down to recession-level equity values.
So I have heard this explained slightly differently, which is that what we're engaged in, or what the Europeans are engaged in, is a prolonged process of kicking the can down the road until after the German elections, which are next year, and also that conveniently kicking the can past the German elections also gives European banks more time to recapitalize. And the way it was explained to me was that if you really
for the kids to eat, so I would, we would set aside the grown-up candy, and they bought that for a while, but now they've wised up to me.
I thought you were going to say that you were imposing a tax, and I was going to tease you about what kind of libertarian conservative you are if you're imposing taxes. But I'm going for the first bad Halloween metaphor, which is to say that of course today is the Day of the Dead, or All Souls Day, and what we seem to have in Europe this morning is more up your alley as the Day of the Undead. So can you explain to me why the Greeks have done what they've done, and why the deal is unraveled, and why our retirement portfolios are all going to tank again?
This is where I will plead a little bit of ignorance, because I'm not entirely sure what's going on inside of Greek domestic politics, because essentially this is, Papandreou originally, I believe, saying, yes, we'll implement this package, but then deciding, no, we're going to put this to a referendum, which of course is what caused all the markets to tank. I have to assume that, in some ways this is what you've seen a lot of European politicians do, which is, on the one hand, they're being asked to implement incredibly unpopular policies. And it used to be the case, 10 years ago when the European countries were trying to create the euro, the promise of the euro seemed great enough so that a lot of countries, particularly in the southern Mediterranean, actually implemented, relatively speaking, forms of austerity as a way to get their budget deficit as a percentage of GDP in line. And they were able to say, we're doing this for the, to join the euro. And I think the problem is that lever is no longer terribly politically powerful. And so as a result, Papandreou, I think, is looking for some other kind of political insulation. And as a result, he's got to do this referendum. Although, I'll be honest, I'm not entirely sure how he's going to get that insulation, because it requires him to actually even more vigorously make the argument. The only thing I can posit is that he really thinks the social fabric of Greece is under that much threat that it requires everyone to own up to this particular problem. I think the larger issue is that really this is just round, 37 of what I call Euro goggles. And I blogged about this for Foreign Policy, but, we've seen this play out now, every 3 months for the last 2 years, which is essentially, the European countries are moving towards crisis. The southern Mediterranean countries are experiencing, higher and higher, either market pressures or increasing debt to GDP ratios. There is some European summit that requires France and Germany. Hello, Blogging Heads Nation. I am Daniel Drezner. I'm a professor of international politics at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and I am also the author of Theories of International Politics and Zombies, a perfect gift one day after Halloween to buy for your loved ones.
I'm Heather Hurlburt, the Executive Director of the National Security Network, and coming down off the kind of candy hangover that you might expect from going out with a 7-year-old dressed as an M&M.
Oh, God, that would have been some serious candy haulage there.
Yes, and there will be a prize for the worst Halloween metaphor employed during this blogging.
Oh, this is good. This will replace the bad zombie puns from my book. But I'll offer my secret Halloween confession. This just shows how much of a bastard I am as a parent. When my kids were much younger, like about 5 years old, and they would go trick or treating. When they would come back, and we would organize the candy, because that's what Drezners do. We organize the candy after we.
I hear a euphemism behind.
Well, I would explain that
right?
there were, you know how you get the bite-sized candy, but then occasionally, some old school households will still give you the full Milky Way bar. I explained that was grown-up candy, and it was just too much candy.
Crammed down the Greek debt, and then by extension the Italian debt, et cetera, right now, or a couple of months ago when this explanation was made to me, the banks actually couldn't take it, but that in another year and a half, they would have recapitalized enough that they could take the hit that they need to take. And what was said to me was, oh, don't worry, I know this looks totally incompetent, but it's actually fine, and it's the best way of edging forward slowly until both the European political economy and its economy can take the fix. Does that have any ring of truth to you, or am I just naively repeating what the bankers want?
I would say two things. On the one hand, politically, I sort of understand that logic. Economically, it's just a bunch of crap. In the sense that... Well, I mean, seriously, it actually... It's one of these things where, by politically kicking the can down the road, you make the problem so much worse that what's going to be required as a way of solving the problem is even more politically unpalatable. Because my understanding is, first of all, you have to separate the Greeks from everyone else. The Greeks are in a true sort of basket case scenario where they're simply going to be incapable of paying off their debt, and a genuine haircut is required.